The rain hadn't stopped for 2 days. It was as if the sky wept for her, mirroring the storm that churned within. In a small apartment on the second floor of a worn-out building in Pune, Aisha sat by the window, watching raindrops trace stories down the glass. Her 2 children, Sarah and Kabir, were asleep in the next room, curled under old blankets, unaware of how their world had shattered just a few months ago. Divorce wasn't something Aisha had ever envisioned. She had tried. She had begged. She had stayed through years of emotional exhaustion, hoping love would return or maybe respect would surface again. But all that remained were raised voices, slammed doors, and the feeling of invisibility. When he left, it wasn't a dramatic goodbye or remorseful tears. He had packed his things in silence and simply disappeared from their lives, leaving behind unpaid rent, emotional scars, and 2 young souls who still asked, "When will Papa come home?" She didn't know how to answer. In the beginning, survival was a minute-by-minute struggle. Rent was overdue. Her part-time data entry job didn't cover groceries, let alone school fees. Every night, she'd count coins in the kitchen drawer, pretending it was a game for the kids. Sometimes, dinner was 2 slices of bread and a promise of better days. She had sold her jewelry, pawned her wedding sari, and once stood outside a temple for 3 hours just to receive free lunch packets. Pride, once her silent armor, had been peeled away by necessity. But what hurt more than hunger was a judgment. Neighbors whispered. Her own relatives called her incomplete. The school principal suggested a guardian figure for the children, subtly implying that a woman alone could not raise them right. Society didn't just break her, it buried her beneath labels. Divorced, unfit, abandoned. No one asked about the nights she stayed awake nursing fevers. No one saw her carry her sleeping kids up 3 flights of stairs after overtime shifts. She was invisible in a world that only saw what it wanted to criticize. But pain, she learned, was a strange fuel. One day, while cleaning the floor, she found an old notebook. It was from college, pages filled with poetry and story drafts she once dreamed of publishing. Something stirred. That evening, after putting her children to bed, she opened her old laptop and wrote. For hours, through tears, through exhaustion, she wrote about pain, about resilience, about motherhood, about starting over. She didn't stop to edit or think. She simply poured her soul into words. She published her first blog post anonymously. The next morning, she received 3 comments. By evening, 15. By the end of the week, she was being invited to write for a local women's group newsletter. Slowly, her words found wings. Women from across the country reached out to her, thanking her for saying what they felt but couldn't voice. Her inbox was filled with stories of betrayal, strength, courage. She wasn't alone, and they weren't either. With every story she shared, she stitched a piece of herself back together. Then came an email from a publisher, a woman who had once walked the same path. She offered Aisha a book deal. It wasn't grand. It wasn't life-changing money. But it was validation. It was hope with a cover page. Aisha's book, Pieces of Whole Heart, launched quietly. It didn't become a bestseller overnight, but it became something more powerful. It became a lifeline for thousands of women. Book clubs formed. NGOs reached out. She was invited to speak on podcasts and at women's shelters. She stood on stages, trembling at first, but slowly finding her voice, the same voice she wanted behind silence. Sarah and Kabir watched her with wide eyes. For them, she wasn't just mom. She was a warrior. Years passed. Her second book hit national shelves. She started her own foundation, offering emotional and financial support to single mothers. She created workshops on rebuilding self-worth. For the first time in her life, people introduced her not as someone's wife or someone's daughter, but as Aisha Khan, author, activist, mother, and inspiration. But fame never changed her core. She still packed lunch for her kids every morning, still repaired school uniforms by hand, still sat by the window when it rained, sipping tea in silence. Only now, the silence was peaceful, not heavy. One evening, after a speaking engagement, a young woman approached her. She looked nervous, clutching a worn-out copy of Aisha's book. "I was going to end my life last year," she said, tears slipping down her cheek. "But your words, they made me believe again. Thank you for surviving." Aisha hugged her, long and firm. That night, Aisha returned home, took off her heels, and lay beside her children. They had grown. Sarah was now 12 and wanted to be a writer. Kabir, 10, loved science and built things out of cardboard. She kissed their foreheads and whispered, "We're okay now." Because they were. Divorce had broken her, but it had also shown her the strength she never knew she had. She didn't just rebuild her life. She redesigned it, with fewer expectations but more purpose, with fewer people but deeper connections, with less fear and more fire. And somewhere in the pages of her past, Aisha stopped being a victim. She became her own hero. So, if you're standing at the edge, feeling broken, forgotten, or afraid, remember her. Remember Aisha, who rose from ashes with nothing but a pen and a promise to her children. Not every chapter starts happy, but every soul has a power to write a new ending. And maybe, just maybe, that next line starts with you. Months later, on a warm spring morning, Aisha stood in front of her children's school auditorium. She had been invited as the chief guest for their annual function, a moment that once would have terrified her. But today, dressed in a simple sari and holding her speech in trembling fingers, she looked over a crowd of parents and students, her eyes finding Sarah and Kabir in the front row. They smiled, eyes glistening with pride. She stepped up to the mic. "I am not a perfect mother," she began, her voice steady. "Nor was I a perfect wife, but I am learning every day to be a stronger human. And everything I built started when the world thought I was finished." The auditorium fell silent. "There are moments in life," she continued, "when you think you've lost everything. But sometimes it's in those moments when you're on your knees that you begin to rise. I once believed my story ended with divorce, but it didn't. It began with it. Because pain, if you let it, can become your greatest teacher." The audience erupted into applause. Teachers wiped tears. Children clapped. But the most beautiful sight was Sarah, who stood and clapped the loudest, whispering to Kabir, "That's our mom." Later that night, when they got home, Kabir placed a drawing in her lap. It was a sketch of her standing tall, a cape fluttering behind her, a notebook in one hand and their hands in the other. At the bottom, he had written in his childlike handwriting, "My superhero doesn't fly, she writes." Aisha smiled. Her eyes welled up. She had once been broken by the world, but now she had rebuilt one, not just for herself, but for every woman who felt unseen. Her scars no longer made her weak. They made her real. Her story no longer shamed her. It saved others. And most of all, her children didn't grow up in a house filled with pain. They grew up watching what true courage looked like. Aisha knew the journey wasn't over. There would still be hard days, moments of loneliness, and questions without answers. But now she had faith in herself, and faith in the truth that life doesn't end when someone leaves. Sometimes that's when it truly begins. Because the strongest women aren't the ones who have never fallen. They're the ones who rise every single time, holding their children in one arm and their dreams in the other. And as the moonlight poured into the quiet apartment that night, Aisha sat at her desk again, not because she had to, but because she was ready to write her next chapter, not just for her, but for all of us.